SUERF, the European Money and Finance Forum, bringing together policymakers, finance, and academia.
Welcome to this SUERF-ECB-Bocconi workshop on Europe's blues, an interdisciplinary approach to weak economic sentiment or to understanding weak economic sentiment. Economic sentiment in Europe is weak. This applies both to consumers and businesses. So what are the sources? Is European pessimism based on fundamental reasons, domestic reasons, European reasons, global reasons, economic, socio-economic, political reasons? Or are also animal spirits in Keynes' meaning, that is self-reinforcing mood swings, which may be driven by the zeitgeist and by the media, are they at play? To what extent is sentiment relevant for actual economic developments? Shedding light on these questions is useful for designing the right policy responses, structural reforms, support of aggregate demand, or the demonstration of strong and united government leadership which sets in motion appropriate structural adjustments and is able to create a credible public narrative. Today's workshop has 3 sessions. Session 1 puts the facts and the data on economic sentiment in the euro area on the table. Session 2 will study underlying drivers. And in session 3, a practitioners panel will discuss whether sentiment matters and what might be the way forward. Before we start, let me give a great thank you to Geoff Kenny, head of the Monetary Economics section in the Directorate General Research at the ECB, for the nice, professional and efficient cooperation in drawing up this workshop. Geoff will also moderate the first session. Over to you, dear Geoff.
Thanks very much, Ernest, for those words of introduction. Very much looking forward to this webinar. And as Ernest just mentioned, this first session is going to be on, taking a look at the latest developments in business and consumer sentiment in the EU. And we're extremely lucky to have, some very distinguished experts in this area who've worked with sentiment surveys for many, many years. So first up is going to be Christian Geyer. And Christian's going to give us a kind of a pan-European perspective on the latest developments in sentiment surveys across the EU. Christian is a senior expert in business and consumer surveys and short-term forecasting at the European Commission. And then following that kind of European perspective, we're going to take a deeper dive into 2 of our big countries in the EU, namely France and Germany. And Erwan Gautier, head of the microanalysis division from the Banque de France, is going to take us through what's happening in France. And then we're also extremely fortunate to have Klaus Wohlrabe, senior economist and head of surveys at the IFO Institut in Munich, to take a deep dive into what's going on in Germany. With those words of intro, I'd like to ask Christian if he wants to share his slides and kick us off.
So yeah, I will follow the agenda proposed by the organizers. So quick overview of where we stand, current position and sentiment, and then see how this compares historically and internationally. So this is our headline indicator, European Commission's headline indicator for economic sentiment, the ESI, which combines business and consumers' views. So here we see it for the past 40 years, together with the 4 past recession phases. So if we look at the more recent 5 years, we see that after the turbulent phase of COVID and then war in Ukraine and energy crisis and high inflation, we are currently or have been in a pretty calm period over the past 2 or 3 years with an unusually long sideways movement of this headline indicator, somewhat below the long-term average. So, and this of course does not in itself speak for much economic dynamism or momentum. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Here, this depicts the ESI for the EU together with international or global indicator. I picked this from COF FGV, so this is the Global Economic Barometer in red here over the ESI, and you see that over the past 25 years, there are clearly shared cycles and movements. As to the current situation, yeah, I mean, similar, somewhat below the average, long-term average. And in their release of early March, COP already hinted at that the latest decrease in March could be connected to the impact of the policy changes that were started to be implemented at the time in the US. So all these data, of course, do not yet reflect the latest decisions in the US on tariffs. So the next slide, please. Okay, here I focus on the consumer side. So this shows the European Commission's Consumer Sentiment Index in blue, along with in red the Michigan Consumer Index for the US. We see also pretty much shared overall movements, especially if we look at the blue one, we see that from the consumer perspective, the post-Ukraine war, energy crisis and high inflation phase was much worse than the COVID crisis itself, with confidence plummeting to an all-time low. And then the recovery that have been seeing since then is pretty slow and imperfect. So the blue line, as you see, has scratched the long-term average a couple of months ago, but has then started to move away again from the long-term average. And this is also the case, similarly, the case for the US, which has, however, already in March recorded a very significant decline, which was due to inflation fears. If we look at the EU consumer confidence, which is made of 4 components, it was the component, the expected general economic situation, what consumers expect about the general economic situation in their in their country, which drove this decline. So, but then, of course, it's interesting to know what actually drives these views on the general economic situation in their country. And on the next slide, we have a timely analysis of this, because in our February and March waves of our consumer survey, we added this supplementary ad hoc question to consumers, where we asked them over the past 12 months, how have these factors, the following factors, influence their views about the economy of their country. And we see that actually, I mean, 3/4 or more than 3/4 of the consumers think that inflation and the high cost of living is negatively impacting their view on their economy, on the economy of their country. So this is the highest negative factor that drives their confidence, so to speak, about their country. And then this is followed by also 2/3 of people seeing global developments and trade policies already before the recent escalation as negatively impacting their economies. Also, political developments in the consumers' countries are a significantly negative factor. So if we look at the country breakdown, we see that in countries like Germany and Austria, where there were difficult processes of forming governing coalitions, that these shares are even higher there in these countries. So, okay, and then, I mean, I will not go through all of this. You see there's a lot of red, so most of these factors are predominantly impacting negatively. The only ray of light here is the technological change, where actually a majority of consumers think that this has a positive impact on the economy of their country. So these results we will publish them on Friday this week, in 2 days, in our quarterly publication, European Business Cycle Indicator. So if you're interested in country breakdowns and also breakdowns by different types of consumers. Okay, then we can move from the consumers back to all the sectors which are covered in the ESI, in the economic sentiment indicators. So here we have the green line, again, the consumers, and the other 4 lines are the sector-specific business confidence indicators. And yeah, I mean, the most interesting thing here is probably the dichotomy between services and industry. Services confidence is the red line that has been hovering here around the long-term average, basically for the past 3 years. While the blue line, which is industry confidence, has come down, has been on a continuous downward trend. And so this gap has opened between the services and the industry sectors. So industry confidence is currently the only one, or has been for a while, that is clearly below the long-term average. So this is the sector perspective, and then the next slide shows the country perspective. So these are the economic sentiment indicators for the 6 largest EU countries. And here, again, the blue line is the most interesting one, which is German economic sentiment. And we see that Germany is the only country of the 6 largest, which is here significantly below the long-term average, and this already for quite some time, and without any clear trend of improvement here so far. Yes. Okay, and then this is already my last slide. This shows the economic sentiment indicator versus our indicator of uncertainty. So while sentiment tries to track optimism or pessimism, the uncertainty indicator rather measures predictability, or how sure respondents are about their optimism or pessimism. And here we see that so the COVID pandemic led to quite similar reactions. So economic sentiment, the blue line plummeted, and the red line, which is uncertainty and which is on the right-hand scale, so it's inverted. Actually, uncertainty shot up in a very comparable manner. That sentiment went down. But then the difference being that while sentiment kind of recovered relatively quickly and was then even higher for a while than before the COVID pandemic, and is currently somewhat below, the red line, which is uncertainty, it never really came down to a level close to where it stood before the pandemic. So still now we observe this kind of gap, which shows that uncertainty remains relatively elevated compared to sentiment and compared to where it stood before the COVID crisis. So yeah, well, I mean, this is it for the time being. I mean, we will see more in April, and I mean, looking at the Centix release of 3 days ago, which I think was the first confidence index to be released after the recent announcements of the US tariffs, we can expect some more vertical lines probably in the next months. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christian. So, Erwan, the floor is yours.
Do you see my screen?
Confirm I can see your slides.
Okay, great. Great news. So thank a lot for this invitation, Geoff and Ernest. I'm very pleased to present some results of Banque de France surveys on firms and consumers' sentiment. So just to let you know that yesterday night we published the latest results of our monthly business survey. I will show you the results, but they are the data were collected just before the tariff announcement, so they are still not reflecting all the uncertainty that will come due to these big changes in the international environment. So I will start with a broad perspective on the French economic sentiment, on the long-term perspective. So on the left-hand side, you see the sentiment among firms and consumers. You see that they are very correlated over time, and one exception might be this inflation period, where the war in Ukraine plus the surge in inflation hurt much more the consumer sentiment, at least at first, than the business sentiment. And now the consumer sentiment is improving a little bit because of this disinflation, the quick disinflation process going in France at the moment. On the right-hand side, you see our Banque de France firm sentiment, business sentiment by sector, and you see that they all converge to something below the long-term average. So we see the slow deterioration in all the sectors, but at the same time, there is still, it's not a recession. So we are not forecasting any recession in 2025 at the moment. And we see some improvement in the latest data in March, and especially in sectors like aeronautics and even in the car industry. But still, we are like in some kind of weak economic growth for most of the sectors, and expecting, and we are still expecting what will be the sentiment next month when the tariff will become effective for Europe. So now if we look at the sentiment at the moment, it's driven a lot by this uncertainty. And we have here a measure. So from our monthly business survey at Banque de France, we measure uncertainty among firms using text analysis. So our monthly business survey is based on interviews with managers in firms, and we can measure with text analysis some comments they made about the economic situation or their own economic situation. And you see that this indicator of uncertainty showed very high peaks during the COVID or during the war in Ukraine. And if you look at the recent period, you see that this uncertainty is rising. So in 2024, mainly because of political uncertainty with parliamentary elections in France, some uncertainty around the public budget at the end of the year. And now we see that this uncertainty remains very high or quite high because of the implementation of the US tariff, or what we expect in terms of US tariff. And you see the latest number, they are still a little bit higher than in February and March, but still pretty close to what we saw previously in February and January. And some CEOs mention this US tariff in particular in the metalworking sector, agri-food, transport, equipment sectors. So in some sectors that are especially exposed to exports, we see more uncertainty in this type of sectors. So of course, this uncertainty has some consequences, especially for firms, this type of, or even households, the wait and see attitudes. So if we look at the quarterly surveys from INSEE, on the left-hand side, the blue and the red lines, they show what is the share of firms reporting some demand or supply constraint to their activity. So if you look at the most recent period, most firms reported supply constraint due to the Ukraine war, the post-COVID period. It was mainly supply constraint. Now, for 2 years, we see more firms reporting demand constraints. So the constraints seem to come more from the demand sector. And if you look on the right-hand side, you see the measure of perceived level of order books by firms, and you see that this perceived level is below the long-term average. It's especially true in the construction, especially for new buildings, which has to do with the high interest rate in 2023, 2024. But it's also true in the manufacturing sector, and again, in some specific sectors like metalworking, chemistry, plastic sectors, where the level of order books is pretty below the average, the long-term average. So uncertainty means also to postpone some decisions, typically investment or consumption decisions for households. So What we saw over the last quarters on the firm side is that they expected to invest less. So clearly the investment sentiment is lower than average and it's decreasing, as you can see on the left-hand side. So weaker investment perspective in services, in industry. We expect that with the lower interest rates and possibly better internal conditions, this investment could come back at some point, but at the moment the perspectives are pretty low if you look at what firms report. And if you have a look at consumers, households, here the yellow line plots the intention to consume. Is it the right time for you to make large purchases? During the inflation surge, there were less people reporting that it was a good time to consume. Okay, but it is due to the rise in inflation. See, with the disinflation process, we see more people thinking that it's the right time to make purchase, but it's still quite below the long-term average. So we think that this consumption, household consumption, could bring more economic growth in the future quarters, especially with less inflation, lower interest rate. It should boost consumption. But at the same time, if you look at the green line, you see that this uncertainty, maybe we could see some precautionary saving. And if you ask people, is it the right time to save? Now there is a lot of people, even and especially over the last months, reporting that it's a very good time to save. And the saving rate, the actual saving rate in national accounts in France is much well above the long-term average. On the positive side, one positive news over the last quarters is that the disinflation is well on track, and inflation in France is now below 1%. If we look at the latest numbers. And this is well perceived by firms. So at the Banque de France, we have a quarterly survey asking firms about their perception and expectation about inflation. And if you look at the green line, their expectation over the next year, you see that this 1 year expectation is now close to 2% since the beginning of 2024. And it's also the case for the long-term inflation expectations. So clearly, firms, they have clearly in mind that inflation is back to normal, and we see that also in their price-setting decisions. Now, the share of price increases has come back to normal levels. So it's a positive news in a sense that it will also boost purchasing power of consumers in the next months. So we expect, if we look at what they expect in terms of wage growth, we see that the purple line, you see that firms expect wage growth to be above the inflation for this year, 2% compared to 1% due to inflation. So purchasing power gains should be a positive factor, especially for household consumption. We still need to be very careful about sort of purchasing power of households, because a lot of households also, there is a difference between what they perceive in terms of gains in purchasing power and what are the actual numbers. So we published yesterday a study looking at a large survey among households. Especially, we asked them what they think about prices and income and their own income over the last 12 months. And as you can see, 75%, more than 75% of people believe that their income did not increase over the last 12 months, which is in contrast with actual numbers, in fact, because we have some indexation in the national wages, in the pensions. Even wages have increased over the last 12 months. And at the same time, they perceive a huge increase in prices. So overall, households perceive large losses in terms of purchasing power, which is a big difference with actual numbers. In actual numbers, we see an increase in 2024 by 2%. But if we look now at the survey, people think that purchasing power has decreased by 6% on average. So here, we need to be very careful about that, especially in these uncertain times where we believe that purchasing power should be, or internal consumption, household consumer consumption could be a main driver of the next economic growth. We need to be careful about how they perceive these purchasing power gains. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Erwan, as well. So then we're going to move to Germany, and Klaus.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I have to speed up a little bit here in terms of time. So thank you for the invitation. I want to talk about a little bit the latest development of business service in Germany. And here you see our main product here, the IFO Business Climate, and its two-component: current situation, the expectations for the next 6 months. As a broader picture, what you can see is that we had, so the maximum in this time series was in 2017, 2018. And since then, we see some kind of continuous decline on average. So business sentiment in Germany declined over the last years, even after the Corona dip and the sharp increase after the Corona crisis. And then we see the drop also beginning in the war in Ukraine. But since then, we have some kind of a side movement, but in overall, we see a continuous decline a little bit. We do not know what happens. If I zoom in a second, we see that we have a substantial increase in the latest release from March, and this March release maybe has partially included the special fund. So for the infrastructure and for the infrastructure fund. But as you see this later, that with respect to the construction sector, I was expecting a little bit more increase in sentiment. If we zoom in, so here are the four main sectors that we cover. And this is the balance statistics, what you see here. And as you see, the only sector or the only line or time series that is in a positive area, so where we have a positive balance statistic, is the current situation in the service sector. All other time series are negative territory. Most pronounced increase in the March publication of the IFO Business Climate was the increase in expectations in manufacturing. There was an increase of 7 balance points, which is actually quite large. So I called it a glimmer of hope here. But as you know, this was before Trump announced all these tariff increases. So with respect to the construction sector, as I said, we had this decision on the special fund of 500 billion euros. So we actually see a slight increase in the construction sector, but I've expected a little bit more. So maybe we see more development or the direction to more positive values in the months ahead. So as you can see, the construction sector is in a severe recession in Germany, which is mainly due to residential construction, not with infrastructure construction here. The good news is that with respect to the consumer price inflation, so these numbers went down. There's also, you've heard in the previous talk, what is good news is also that the IFO price expectations, so the price expectation generally do a quite good job here. So they increased a little bit over the last month. So we are still over the 2% level, but in the medium to long run, we expect that inflation will settle down at 2%. So here as you know, exports are very important, not only for Germany, but especially for Germany. And very important, our question with respect to exports. And we see, I labeled this the calm before the storm. So as you can see, there some kind of sideward movement of 2 years. So there was no real dynamics in the sentiment of exporters. but a substantial increase in the last months. But I expect that these numbers will drop substantially with the release of the April values. And this is especially interesting if you zoom in, that we see the automotive sector here is slightly positive. So I think also that they will return to the negative area, so to say, in the next months. So it will be very interesting how large the drop will be. A short note on the consumer climate is actually quite similar to what Christian said, but on a lower level, so to say. As you can see, the German consumers have still a lot of fears and uncertainty, because, as you can see, the consumer climate published by the JFK is approximately on the same level as during the Corona crisis. As also Christian said, after the start of the war in Ukraine, the sentiment on consumers plummeted, but there's no real increase in consumer climate recently. So it's also a sideward movement here, which is quite often seen on many survey results at our institute. Additionally to these time series evidence, when concerned with consumers, with business surveys, always consider with time series. And what is important is that also that you can include ad hoc questions. Christian already said that they had ad hoc questions in the March for the consumers, and yet also an ad hoc question over several countries in the business survey. So results will be released soon. And we at the IFO have these a lot of occasionally on our questionnaire. So we, for instance, for research, extreme weather, climate change, the introduction of the minimum wage in Germany and tax reform. And we include on a regular basis special questions since COVID-19 with respect to different levels. The focus is always on the impact and direction of firms. So it's not kind of an opinion poll, but given that something happens, economic policy or something like that, we want to see or to know how firms react. So these are about actual issues, no planned or potential issues. Actually, hard facts that we can ask. And why we're doing this, we want to support evidence-based policy advice so that we can give more input beyond the IFO business climate. And I think that's very important. Yeah, and we can react quickly to recent events. So surely we want to do something with the tariffs by Trump. To give you an idea of what we do here, so for instance, we asked in November last year, a general outlook for 2025, so a different forecast horizon. You see the outlook for the German firms was not that favorable. So a lot of firms, 1/3 said, okay, that is going to 2025 will be less favorable compared to 2024. So this is quite good insight that we can use also for research. And with respect to Trump, we had we asked firms in September 2024, so before the election, the exposure to the US economy. Because of time, I do not want to go into details. And we asked the firms, if Trump is elected compared to Kamala Harris, how this will affect their business. And as you can see, approximately 40 to 50% are negatively or fairly negatively affected. And only a few ones stated that this is positive impact of a Trump election. And as a final word, final statement, we started our survey in November, 2 days before the election, and then we took a look how this affected survey results. And we see that after it was well known that Trump is going to be the next president, the expectation dropped, and this is mainly driven by exporters. So we expect a large drop in the export expectations in April. So we have only seen this in November results that business expectations were worse after the firms have known or realized that Trump will be the next president. So yeah, I stop here.
Thank you, Klaus, as well. So that covers the ground in the three presentations we had planned for this session. So I'd like to open the floor for any questions. I did see a question on whether the slides will be available and so forth. And I understand that that is fully the case. But I mean, I want to throw out one question to the three speakers as well, if I can, as chairing this session. And so, I mean, the title of today's webinar is Europe's Blues. And I think if I look across the three presentations, I do indeed hear plenty of blues music. I hear a lot of uncertainty, a lot of sentiment indicators below long-term averages. I hear discussions about scarring. And I guess I want to ask you, maybe either Christian taking the more pan-European perspective, or Klaus and Erwan in the case of Germany and France, where might there be some jazz to kind of counteract this blues music that we're listening to? What are the positive aspects that are in the data, or that are most salient to you in the data? I think some things were mentioned, like the lower inflation, but that is my question to you, in the interest of avoiding too much asymmetry in our discussion of the sentiment indicators. I don't know if you guys might want to respond in the order that we had the presentation, and then in the meantime, I will also start looking at the chat to see what other questions there are.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Geoff. Well, this is indeed not an easy question. I have to think hard. I mean, I think the good news or development is indeed that we have already seen that in Erwan's presentation. I mean, the assessment of price developments, so that, I mean, the market participants, both the consumers, but of course also the managers, when they speak about their own selling price expectations, I mean, they do realize that that inflation has come down. Still, also this comes with a little pinch of salt, because if we look at the selling price expectations at the EU level, in all the four business sectors, we see nevertheless that they are still above the long-term average. So, I mean, there has been a lot of improvement, but still, I mean, there is still some doubt. Apart from the price inflation developments, I mean, there have been some improvement recently in the last months in March. So as especially we've seen in Klaus' presentation for Germany, but that's to some degree also visible in the EU developments. But okay, I mean, this might have been supported by the spending decisions in Germany on infrastructure, defense, and so on. But of course, this is now likely overpowered by the more recent development. So, yeah.
So we should definitely move over to Erwan and Klaus as well. I'm looking at the chat, and maybe I'll mention things because we may not have too much time to go back and forth. But several of the questions have indeed taken up this issue of the scarring that you discussed, Erwan, and its possible link to the persistent inflation and the lack of full adjustment of real wages following the inflationary shock. So that may be something you want to reflect on as well. And then also just picking up on my question and what you mentioned relating to the infrastructure spending and the defense related spending and imperatives in Europe at the moment. It might be interesting also to hear from Klaus if he thinks that is an important green shoot for the economy, or whether there are also potential negative effects of fiscal expansion on sentiment as well. But Erwan, to you first.
Yes, so on the scaring effects, for sure there are some scaring effects among consumers, and still there might be missing some like of confidence shock or trust shocks for people to consume more. what I want to say is maybe that given the high uncertainty, given the outside environment, we could still see, at least in France, some resilience of firm activity, and we can see some positive growth, still positive economic growth, and this is what we forecast for this year, a quite positive economic growth for France, which is some kind of good news in a sense, given the big inflation shock we had, given the high uncertainty at the moment. There are still some hope, and I think it comes mainly from Europe and mainly from internal drivers of economic growth.
Thanks, Erwan, and over to you, Klaus.
Yeah, so you asked for positive news. So actually, there is a positive news. These large increase in manufacturing we've seen in the expectation. We discussed this internally and said, okay, this was maybe due to a reduction of uncertainty, because we have potentially a stable new government with only two parties. So there was a large disagreement with the old government, and then after we had this new election, this reduced uncertainty among firms. So this was the good news, and also the special fund also increased sentiments or improved sentiments. And so it will be interesting to see, because we have two overlapping developments. So the bad news which induced also a large amount of uncertainty on the one hand side with the Trump tariffs, and also the potential real effects with respect to our export industry. And on the other side, the positive influence of aspects that reduces uncertainty. So more good planning horizon for the construction industry, because this is set for 12 years. So this might be more investment in capacities and so on. So this is interesting to see how this will actually affect sentiments among firms over the next month. So it's not quite clear cut. And I don't know which will be overweight the other one or the other way around. I don't know.
Yeah, thanks, three. So the other questions I see in the chat, but maybe we'll be able to come back to them also as we proceed with the webinar today, related to any insights particularly linked to sentiment in the services sector, which of course is such a big part of our economies as well. So this was a question that was directed in your direction, Christian, as well. But I'm looking at the time, and I'm probably thinking we are indeed out of time now for this first session. Maybe to thank the three of you for the presentations and the open discussion. And I guess we didn't really get to focus in on what we are expecting to happen to sentiment indicators in April. And certainly that's something I hope we get a chance to come back to over the course of the next two sessions as well. But with that, Ernest, I think I hand over to you.
Thank you, Geoff. We now turn to the question, what drives consumer and business sentiment? We have three outstanding experts with us to discuss these issues. Welcome to Katharina Gangl, who is an economic and social psychologist and head of the research group Behavioral Economics at the Institute for Advance Studies in Vienna. Geoff, you already know, and Alistair Macaulay, Surrey Future Fellow in Economics and winner of SUERF's Marshall Prize in 2022. Without further ado, over to you, Katharina. Katharina, please unmute your microphone.
Hi, my name is Katharina Gangl. I'm from the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna. And I will give you some thoughts that I have on the behavioral economics perspective on the current reduced consumption. First of all, I would like to give you a short definition about the behavioral economics perspective. In classical economics, or the standard economic assumption, is a theoretical assumption on humans, and it assumes that humans are rational and try to maximize their utility. In behavioral economics, based on empirical, mostly experimental studies, over the last decades, we concluded or came up with the assumptions that humans try to be rational, they want to maximize their utility, but they fail because of cognitive biases, emotions, social dynamics, and the situation in general. So this is a deeply, I would say, empirical uncovering of human drivers of behavior. What's important is that also these biases, as some people call them, are not just individual problems, but we can also find them on an aggregate level, on the macro level. So there are specific cognitive mechanisms that we can find in many people, and that also determine specific economic developments. Well, concerning such a behavioral economics perspective on the current consumption patterns, I tried to find some studies, but I couldn't. So from my perspective, there's a lack of experimental studies that try to understand why people right now react to the current inflation in the way they do. Also, we don't have any studies from different countries that could compare how maybe cultural or specific economic backgrounds impact these behaviors. So the mechanisms that are currently determining what we see in the data in the last sessions are, to me at least, not very well known from an empirical point of view. Just the Gray literature, as the session before shows, that the consumer sentiment has a problem already for several years. For example, the New Year's Eve resolutions for 2024 and also for Germany and Austria revealed already that people's most important wish for the next year was to save money. So it was more important than, for example, to do sports as it was in previous years. So saving not only became more important, but it was the most important thing that people wanted to do. Also, in the last elections that we had here in Austria, but also in the United States, again, people said the inflation, the rising prices are the main reasons why I vote what I vote. So obviously, already for a longer time, the prices are really a problem for many people, and it really strongly impacts very important behaviors that they show. My assumption is that, as we already saw in the last sessions, that this is a problem in so many different countries, and all of these countries had different policies that they tried out and so on. So there must be some fundamental things going on. I think that's clear. However, behavioral mechanisms still play a role. First of all, they might accelerate the effect of these fundamental developments. And secondly, they might also explain why these classical conservative countermeasures don't work. For example, in Austria, the idea was, let's rise salaries and then people will consume again, and that failed totally. Well, then, as I said, we don't have data from the current crisis, but we can maybe learn a little bit from data from previous crises or from previous studies. There are many mechanisms that I could present to you. I just chose 4. That's also maybe something very different to a classical economic perspective, that in behavioral economics we don't have one single theory of humans, but we have to study how humans in a specific situation understand the situation. One, however, general pattern is that lay people have a different understanding of the economy than experts. Lay people understand the economy based on core concepts like inflation or unemployment. So people see inflation and they immediately think, there's an economic crisis. And it's different to experts who think, well, inflation and salaries and everything is connected with each other. There are relationships, dynamics. Lay people don't think like that. However, whatever they perceive is the basis for what and how they behave. And Birgit, in savings, we already talked about the many crises that people now perceived, and also many monetary losses maybe that were experienced also during the Corona crisis. So people, of course, want to save money. Also, they want to gain back maybe the losses they had. In one study we conducted based on the economic recession during the Corona crisis, we showed with an experiment that people who lost money during the crisis then were more willing to do tax evasion because they wanted to gain the money back through evasion. And of course, from a state's perspective, that's bad news, because you lose money from the recession and then you lose money again because people now evade more than before. For people, it's also important why the inflation or why rising prices occur and if they think this is fair or not fair. And one recent study showed that this is different for every product category. And one recent study showed that the current energy prices increases were perceived as unfair. So people didn't feel that these energy prices are the result of some natural things, but they thought this is an unfair political course of these rising prices, and they felt that this was somehow a betrayal. Or, well, they were not. These prices were not seen as a natural event, but something that was caused by politics, maybe, or by international politics. And then, of course, they get more angry and they don't want to accept the prices. Trust is the fundament of our economy. Of course, it's also important here. The consumer sentiment in basically is a trust and confidence measure. So everything we can do is to regain trust, and that can be done by showing competence, motivation, and benevolence of politicians. That's also interesting. In one study that we did in the last economic crisis, people don't feel that it's the economy's the fault of the economy if things go wrong, but they think it's the politicians who have to act. So the politicians have to show that they're competent, motivated, and benevolent to solve this crisis. My conclusion is that we need more behavioral studies to understand what's really going on, and only then we can maybe come up with measures to raise the sentiment. For example, first of all, we could try to find out why people have biased perceptions of the current inflation, and what products and services are mostly affected by these biased perceptions. And based on that, with experiments, we could find ways to correct that biases. Another thing is that we could look out for substitutes for behaviors and ways to promote these substitutes. For example, flexible energy behaviors. There is now the possibility to use technology to control your energy consumption. So, for example, that your car is loaded during a lunchtime and there is lots of sun, and this technology can easily save you up to 25% of your energy bill. And just imagine that all of our households would have this technology, or our businesses would have that technology in the current situation with these high energy prices. That really would make an impact. And it's just a matter of accepting this technology. It doesn't involve any costs, nothing. People just have to choose another tariff. So how can we motivate people to go to this cheaper and better technologies and behaviors? And then another way is people want to save, and I think we all can understand that nowadays you want to save money, but maybe there are better ways to save money that also are positive for our economy than just keeping the money on the bank account. Of course, we could motivate people to go to the stock market. We could motivate people to start renovating houses. It would also be good for environmental reasons and so on. I think if you talk with experts, we will come up with let's say reasonable things where people could put the money but save at the same time. Yeah, and then we need to create trust, of course. So we need to, and that's something we learned from the Corona crisis, where we only had one group of experts, people who were focusing on viruses. But if you want to really deal professionally with the crisis, we need multidisciplinary experts that cover the whole range of this crisis, and that means medical things was in the Corona crisis the main thing, but it's always a multitude of expertises you need, and we have to show the public that all of these experts work together. They're really motivated, they have a good intention, they really mean the best to the people, they want the best things for the people, they cooperate and they closely collaborate and respect the perspective of consumers and businesses, and also those people who have then to implement the measures. Because we also have a problem of the public believes that the experts are like somewhere above the sky and just lost contact to normal people. So we really have to show and make them believe that we are the people, that experts and people work together. And also time matters, especially if you talk about behavioral economics measures, then it's always easier to do it faster and not somewhere when things are so stuck already that it's difficult to change it with these kind of measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katharina. This was really an interesting input. So we should look more at the psychology of people when we do measures. Let's switch over to Geoff directly.
Yeah, so indeed, thanks, Ernest. Thanks, Katharina, for that very interesting presentation covering a lot of important ground. So I'm going to focus in on a very specific question that is certainly linked to what Katharina was talking about. So we're going to look at how geopolitical risks, geopolitical tensions, how they may affect household sentiment, household expectations, and spending behavior. And these are, of course, my own views and not necessarily the views of the ECB or the Euro system. So, I mean, this first slide is really just kind of, you know, almost a summary, I think, of what was said on the household sector in the first session. You know, over the past second half of 2024, for example, there are signs of deteriorating consumer sentiment in the euro area. In particular, you can see a rise in the share of consumers who expect a recession 1 year ahead, and also somewhat more modestly an increase also in the share who expect a worse financial situation for their own household over the coming year. And you can also see the kind of increase in plans to make durable goods purchases, so big ticket consumption purchases across the euro area, which has been increasing. The increases in this have now died away, with there now being a kind of a static evolution regarding the plans to make durable purchases, and this all in an environment where inflation has come down and real wages have been growing. So this is really the context into which we wanted to look at the question of whether the geopolitical situation may be an important part of this weaknesses in consumer sentiment. And looking back over the last few years, it's of course no news to anybody in the webinar that we have observed, you know, rising tensions globally, particularly linked to military conflicts, and also diplomatic tensions across the globe, which, you know, are impacting the peaceful course of international relations. And of course, as we are seeing, you know, in recent days and weeks, international commerce and trade. And there is a literature on this. It is typically focused on firms, in actual fact, focusing on the effects on trade and investment of firms associated with geopolitical risks and geopolitical tensions, where indeed negative effects on firm trade and firm investment have been identified. And we simply now use the ECB's Consumer Expectations Survey to study how such risks may be transmitting to the household sector. So at the end of 2024, we included a special question in the ECB's survey where we asked people individually, how concerned are you about the impact of the current geopolitical environment on the financial situation of your household looking forward over the next 12 months? And, you know, when you ask this question, what you can see is a upwardly skewed level of concerns, you know, with the peak or modal level of concerns being at 7 on a scale of 0 to 10. And of course, not shown here, but there is a considerable amount of heterogeneity across the population in their answers to this type of question. And if we look across the population, we find that lower income households are typically more concerned. Also, liquidity constrained households, who are often also lower income households, And then interestingly, also, again, these are conditional correlations. So conditional on income and your access to liquidity. Also, if you are university educated, so more knowledgeable perhaps about global affairs, this is also typically associated with a higher level of concern. And we observe across our survey a number of very significant correlations with indicators of consumer sentiment. So people with high concerns about the geopolitical environment tend to expect a worse financial situation. They see an augmented probability of losing their own job, and also an augmented probability of a financial crisis. And on the right-hand side chart, you can also see that they are typically more uncertain about their own income over the coming year. And literature has pointed to a very strong effect from uncertainty to actual spending behavior, in line with precautionary savings motive. So we use the survey to try and go from those correlations that I've just shown you to a more causal analysis. And we can do this in an experimental context using the consumer expectation survey, where we can ask the respondents to the survey to consider 3 different scenarios where we vary randomly across representative subgroups of the survey the duration of ongoing military conflicts. And we asked them to consider 3 different scenarios, one in which there was a relatively quick resolution of conflicts, and then 2 other scenarios where the conflicts were more persistent, persisting for up to a year, and then for 3 years and more. And so this analysis, because of the random assignment of the different scenarios across the respondents to the survey, now has a causal interpretation in terms of how the duration of military conflicts around the globe pass through 2 important indicators of consumer sentiment. And what you see is a very significant expectation that a longer enduring conflict will spill over to more conflicts with other countries. So a broadening of geopolitical and military conflicts. And this is also associated with very significant impact on expectations, generating more gloomy expectations, particularly for expectations of lower economic growth and higher inflation. So I think there was a question in the chat earlier from Ernest about whether there is this supply shock interpretation of higher inflation. And certainly this type of geopolitical scenario has the feature that is broadly perceived as a supply shock, resulting in higher inflation and lower economic growth. There's also a clear distinction in how the prolongation of conflicts transmit to different asset prices. In particular, and I think that's certainly consistent with what we've been seeing very recently, we see a clear transmission of these geopolitical shocks to stock prices and the prices of other financial assets, a very sharp increase in expectations that stock prices and other financial assets will decrease. But interestingly, house prices, which you can see here in this chart, they're not really affected by this prolongation of geopolitical conflicts. So how does this, what we've discussed up to now is the effects on sentiment, on expectations. How might you expect this to translate into actual spending behavior? And one way to look at that is to look at measures of the marginal propensity to consume. So how much out of a positive wealth shock or income shock a consumer is willing to spend versus save. And what you can see basically in this analysis is that those who are expecting a worsening of their financial situation clearly have a substantially lower marginal propensity to consume out of a given shock to their wealth. So again, this points to a very significant precautionary behavior that is generated by this type of shock that would indeed negatively affect spending, and also, of course, come on top on any first order effects associated with negative effects on income itself. So this is concluding my presentation. This is really just a summary of what I've just said. And you can read more. We have a recent Vox EU column where we've described these results, and also just published this week on the ECB's webpage as well. We have a blog where we describe it in a bit more detail, the results of this analysis. Thank you. Back to you, Ernest.
Thank you, Geoff. Let's now conclude this session with Alistair. Alistair, over to you.
Great. Can you see my slides?
Yes. Make it large, please. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much to Ernest and the organizers for putting this event together and inviting me to talk a little bit about text and media data. I think it basically can offer a useful complement to the surveys and survey-based results we've been discussing, particularly because you can potentially observe media data in real time. In a rapidly changing environment, that might be very useful. So to give you an extremely brief overview, when you get hold of some text data, perhaps some newspaper articles or some broadcast transcripts, there's a whole host of things you might want to do with them. And the first and most obviously relevant to today's discussion is you can try and measure the sentiment of that text. Now, there's a bunch of different ways of doing that, ranging from simple counts of positive and negative words to more sophisticated machine learning approaches. Which one you choose will depend a lot on your context. But you can also go a lot further and try and measure other things. And one of the things I want to do in this presentation is convince you that that's also useful. So we can dig a bit under the skin of sentiment and ask, well, what topics are being discussed and what kind of narratives are being put forward in the media? Now, to make that more concrete, I want to show you as an example some of my own work with Wenting Song that combines a few different techniques. So this is a paper about the US, but the same approach could very easily be applied to the European context. So in this paper, what we wanted to know was whether the media narratives that were circulating in the US in 2019 affected the way sentiment responded to a major financial event, which was the inversion of the yield curve in that autumn. And to figure that out, we started out by collecting a large sample of media reports on the yield curve inversion. And then we used a topic model to classify those media reports based on the main narrative that they were putting forward. I'll be more specific about those narratives in a second. Once we've got those articles, we link them to the social media activity of people engaging with them on Twitter, as it was then. So we can see the things that people posted in a window before and after they encountered a particular story. And then finally, we use a machine learning algorithm developed specifically for social media posts to give us a sentiment score to the tweets that people are sending. So the idea is we can then estimate, did people get more or less optimistic after they saw a story about the yield curve inverting? And did that response vary depending on the narrative of the article that they saw? And the basic answer is yes to both of those questions. So the top graph on this slide here is showing you sentiment changes among people who saw news articles advancing a narrative that said, the yield curve is inverted, that means a recession is coming. So the way you should read this, in the 3 days before they saw the article, sentiment among these people was pretty constant. When they saw the article, their sentiment dropped quite substantially. The y-axis here is sentiment changes. So in levels, what this means is sentiment dropped and it then stayed persistently low, at least for the 3 days afterwards, as I've got on this graph. Now, to put the magnitude of this in context, in our data sample, we also have a release of a US jobs report that was a reasonably large positive surprise relative to consensus forecasts. The sentiment increase after that release is about the same size as this decrease we're seeing here. Obviously, jobs report releases are a really big deal in US financial markets, so we interpret this as being a pretty substantial sentiment change. Now, the bottom graph does exactly the same exercise for people who saw articles with exactly the same raw information. The yield curve is inverted, but which emphasized other narratives that didn't link so strongly to coming recessions. In particular, there were lots of stories at the time arguing that, well, the yield curve has just been flattening over time. It's all about QE. It's all about demographics. And for people who encountered those stories, there's really no change in sentiment. So the lesson from that analysis, and that I think can apply to more broad analysis of other events, is that people don't just respond to raw economic data when they're forming their beliefs and forming their sentiment. They're also responding to the narratives that circulate, particularly the narratives circulating in the media at the time. And yet, while this was a specific context, a specific analysis, we think it's very plausible that the same lesson applies to other events. Wenting and I actually have an earlier paper finding similar things for stories about inflation, for example. So that's an example of the kind of thing I think you can do with text data, particularly from traditional and social media. And there's potential to do a lot more with this, especially in terms of real-time tracking of these objects. But it's not all roses. There are also pitfalls to using this kind of data, and I want to highlight one in particular that is especially relevant, particularly to some of the debates we've been having in this workshop so far. So I'm going to illustrate the problem just with some hypothetical sentiment data. It fluctuates a lot over time, but has a constant mean of 0. And for the sake of argument, I'm going to say this is sentiment about AI and technology. Now, because this is media, we're only going to observe the text of an article on AI when the editor of that newspaper thinks AI is newsworthy. And the issue we're going to have is that that editorial process can introduce some pretty serious selection bias into our data. So in particular, there's a popular saying in journalism that if it bleeds, it leads. So catastrophes, negative events are much more newsworthy than positive stories. If we take that idea to the extreme, we could suppose in our little example that editors only publish stories on this topic if it's bad news, only if sentiment is below this dashed threshold. Well, in that case, all we see when we look at media data is these data points I've highlighted in red, which means that even if we're doing a really good job of measuring the sentiment of each article we observe, we're going to massively underestimate the actual average sentiment here because we only see it on its worst days, and we miss any positive news and positive spikes. In fact, it could get even worse if editorial decision-making changes over time. So suppose that other non-AI topics get gradually more newsworthy over time. And that's what I'm simulating here. So in effect, the criteria for AI news to be newsworthy gets more and more stringent over time in this example. And by the end of my time period, you might think, I don't know, tariffs are dominating the news. Only a credible prediction of Armageddon is going to get AI into the front pages. Well, if that's what's happening to this threshold over time, if we just observe the red dots, it's going to look like sentiment is falling off a cliff, even though the underlying sentiment actually has a constant mean of 0. Now, obviously, I've contrived this to make the point as stark as possible. In reality, news media does report on positive stories, just less often than negative ones. But whatever the bias is, as long as the reporting decisions are not being made randomly, you're going to be vulnerable to issues of this type. And this really does matter in real data, not just hypothetical examples. So if you look at European stock markets in the last few days, there was a big drop in asset prices on Monday, then a small rebound yesterday. Well, that rebound would not have been a big enough stock price movement to make the mainstream news, were it not for the fact that tariff impacts are extremely newsworthy right now. So if you're just measuring the sentiment in media reports about stock markets, it will look like yesterday's sentiment was actually pretty positive relative to long-run average stock market reporting. Now, that's clearly not a good reflection of actual stock market sentiment. It's just a case of changing editorial decisions. So what can we do? Well, the most obvious answer is to only look at data where there's no real editorial selection. The Financial Times is almost certain to publish something every time there's a new UK CPI release, for example. So just focusing on those stories, we get around the problem. That is quite restrictive, though, on what kind of things we can analyze. So a second option is to do as Wenting and I did for the yield curve, and compare different reports about the same event, and then use those cross-sectional comparisons to answer some aggregate question. Your third option is then to dive a little bit more into the econometrics, or just heuristically look a bit at the frequency of reporting. As our measured sentiment was falling a lot here, we can also see the frequency of reports is falling. That might be a bit of a red flag that what you're seeing might be spurious. And the final option is to see this editorial process as something else we can learn from, rather than an issue to be avoided. So if editors are choosing which topics to report based on their impression of what consumers want to know about, well, their selection could also be informative about the issues at the forefront of people's minds. Indeed, there's some fascinating work from Larsen and Thorstrud that I've cited here, that finds that the selection of which topics appear in the news can predict measures of aggregate sentiment, macroeconomic developments, asset prices, and so on. And these things you can also measure in real time. Right, let me wrap it up there. I think media data can be fantastic for analyzing sentiment. It's clearly very important for sentiment developments. The key issue I've highlighted that I really think you shouldn't ignore is this concern that media reporting is selective. But there are ways to deal with that as long as you know it's there. And I think if you deal with it, there are huge opportunities to use this massive data in new and exciting ways. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Alistair. So I'm sure you will have a future as consultant for the many researchers who do text-based analysis in order to avoid biases and spurious results. Now, we have actually almost exhausted our time. We have a couple of minutes. I just, yes, I see here a question by Mario, I think, that has just come up for Alistair. Given the biases you mentioned, then also policy uncertainty indices should be treated with caution, a sort of variant to the Goodhart law at play. And then there is a question by Leopold Shevzik to Katharina, how behavioral economics can be made operational, let's say, for economic analysis and maybe even for forecasting. And then I myself came up with the idea that maybe we should introduce the concept of perceived real income. You know, having seen Erwan's presentation and also heard Katharina, it's not actually the actual real income that counts, but the perceived real income and the perceived loss in purchasing power. This is particularly relevant for Austria, where we didn't have a loss of real wages actually. And then also coming back to Katharina, so given what you said on trust, what might be the effect of populism and aggressive language, you know, among politicians from the opposition parties nowadays, also in the media, on trust and therefore on economic sentiment? So just short answers, maybe, that we don't take too much time from the third session.
Who should start?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, first on perceived income. Yes, as a psychologist, I have to say the perception matters more than reality for people's behavior. And concerning income, it's very important how you perceive your income relative to others. So it's always the relative income to others that makes you feel poor or rich. And I already talked to millionaires who feel poor because they compare themselves to billionaires. And that's the reason, well, so the perception is very, very much related also to what then people want to do, and it determines their economic behaviors, and the relative income matters. Concerning trust and populism, trust is a very, there are many determinants that for trust. Populism is one of them, but I think it's just one. It's not, surely not the main determinant that drives trust currently. Because in fact, the society we live in is probably the most trustworthy society we ever lived in. Most of us are trustworthy compared to the times after the war, but people also get more sensitive and people have a biased perception of their own past. And there are many reasons why people think always it was better in the past, but actually it's very good nowadays. Maybe are just more people are more sensitive what happens because we already reached such a high level that even small things make them trust less. But nonetheless, many determinants are there, and populism, I think, is just one. And concerning the study, thank you very much for that question. I think about that already for a long time, and I just wait for somebody to give me the money to really make such studies on the current situation. But I didn't have the resources, so I only had short ideas about that, but at least we could look at the most important products and services and see why people want to save there or don't want to consume there. Then we could look which of these reasons are rational and which reasons are irrational. And then we can decide, okay, what can we do about the rational reasons and what can we do about the irrational reasons? And on the irrational reasons, for example, we could run online experiments in which we just try out how to explain the situation to people such that this irrationality fades out. But there are many ideas how you could do it. Also depends how much possibilities you have to really go to real data, like for example work with shops and so on, or work with banks, so you can have real data, not just survey intentions, because intentions do not really perfectly relate to behavior. So the more you get real behavior, and that's possible, the better your data is.
Thank you, Katharina. I think the last question that we have here, which was to Alistair, is also relevant for Geoff. Now, regarding uncertainty indexes, to what extent they should also be treated with caution?
Yeah, I guess I can start. So I think in principle, you're completely right that these economic policy uncertainty indices are computed from newspaper data. That means there has been an editor at some point in the generation of that data deciding whether this story is newsworthy or not, and that's going to potentially introduce some bias. I think the nice thing about the commonly used economic policy uncertainty indices is they do include an awful lot of articles. In particular, they include a lot of these kind of regular articles where the Financial Times is reporting on UK inflation, for example. And there's not really an editorial selection process there because they're going to report on that every time there's a new release. So that regular reporting kind of mitigates some of the concerns that you'd get if you were looking at newspaper reporting about a specific topic, which maybe doesn't have quite the same regular features. But yeah, in principle, the biases are potentially there, and it would be an interesting and useful thing to look into which articles, what type of articles are really driving movements in those policy uncertainty indices as we measure them.
Thank you. I think that sort of also links to the question of framing and bias creation through questionnaire design. I think final word for Geoff maybe on this issue.
Yeah, indeed. So thanks also for that question on the uncertainty. And I think and indeed I've kind of appreciated also what Alistair has said in terms of the kind of the caution we need to exercise regarding text-based measures of uncertainty. And that's why it's good that we have alternatives, including the type of uncertainty measure that I presented, which is a survey-based method that is kind of introduced by Mansky to basically get respondents to assign probabilities to different outcomes for their income, and use that to try and fit distributions and measure a true concept of individual level uncertainty. Of course, they don't come also without their difficulties as well. But I think what one sees is, despite, so for example, there was the reference to the economic policy uncertainty. I am certain, I think I've actually seen it, that the trade policy uncertainty indicators that are out there, that are based on text analysis, based on newspaper articles, are absolutely soaring through the roof right now, and no doubt rightly so. But one may need to bear in mind also the caveats that apply to them when we're doing serious analysis. And then I really just wanted to kind of really thank Katharina for mentioning the trust issue as well. I think it's so central to this whole discussion, and it's so central to how policymakers interact with the public and other constituents regarding what's going on in the economy. And I mean, a good example is, of course, the inflation pattern over recent years. And I think that positive narrative linked to the control of inflation and the eventual bringing down of inflation is a narrative that policymakers really need to get out there. And there is evidence that it has been contributing to an increase in trust in central banks, for example, over the recent past.
Thhank you very much, Geoff. This concludes this session, and I hand over directly to Birgit.
Thank you, Ernest. Welcome to our audience to the third and last session. We will deal with the question on the relevance of fundamentals versus the relevance of sentiment. You have heard now different perspectives on sentiment, and now we try to bring in fundamentals as well. I don't think it's an either or, but we'll try to enrich you in this. I happen to be now in Germany when the big fiscal stimulus was announced. And in contrast to one of my speakers, I will challenge him later on this, I did not see a swing in the mood. So this is something very, very tricky to assess. As we have seen, people are doing it with different methodologies to assess when sentiment is really getting better and what this implies. So in this session, we dig deep on the ingredients of the European blues. And let me remind you that normally the lyrics of a blues, they deal with bad luck in life or bad luck in love. And we don't have a lot of time in Europe to do this now. So I think that, as was pointed out at the beginning, the urgency of this whole workshop is extremely high, because we must get into an acting mode and we must find out whether we are held back by fundamentals or simply bad mood. In this session, we go without slides, we go in 3 rounds, and we try to pin down this big discussion, sentiment versus fundamentals, on 2 economic indicators: savings behavior and investment behavior. And then we finish with the 3rd round on saying, is fundamentals the problems or sentiment? And for these 3 rounds, I have 3 wonderful experts. The first one is Mario Pietrunti, working at BNP Paribas, and he points out that households have a rather backward-looking perspective, whereas business looks forward when they decide on investment. And Mario says that he expects savings rates to structurally settle at a higher level than we have had savings rates in the pre-COVID era. Laurent is accountable and responsible for the EIB corporate survey, so he can give us insight on firm investment and why it is muted. He will talk about uncertainty, lack of skilled labor, and energy costs holding back investments. So you already here, we will see some fundamental aspects on investment behavior. And last but not least, Arne Holzhausen from Allianz brings up the question, is it chicken or egg? We come back to the question, fundamentals or sentiments. Yes, sentimentals, according to Arne, they can lead until fundamentals snap back. So you have already some flavor of where my speakers will go. And I would like to ask the first question and start with Mario. Are consumers' current savings rates exaggerated by historical standards in the light of economic fundamentals? Mario, please.
Thank you, Birgit, and thanks to the organizers, to Ernest and Geoff, for this wonderful workshop, and also to the panelists for the insights that they shared with us today. Look, I'm not an academic economist. I'm a market economist, and my role is to make sense of what happens in the world. And there are days in which it's not very easy to do that. But nonetheless, so what I'm seeing at the moment in Europe, and this was highlighted by some of the previous speakers, notably Christian and Erwan, is that, so despite improved fundamentals in Europe, household confidence remains pretty low. And I think it's due to the fact that there's a backward-looking component in the behavior of households. This has also been discussed by Katharina in the previous panel, in that essentially they feel that they've taken a severe hit from these very large, unexpected rise in inflation, which they were not prepared at all, because they were coming from decades of stable and low inflation. And so this, as Erwan said, created a scar on consumers. And even though inflation has fallen back to essentially to the ECB target or close to that, households still don't feel they are fully over these episodes. So it will take some time to fully digest this nasty episode and move on. Let's not also forget that, and this is a big difference compared to the US, the inflation has eroded most of the excess savings that were accumulated during during the pandemic, and this is also a further negative. And the inflation shock was very visible for European households in that it affected items like utility bills, food, and so on, that are very salient for consumers in the everyday purchases. So if this is the recent past that is still affecting their behavior, if they turn their head to the future and look forward, well, what they see is a much more uncertain world compared to the past. And so this is also not helpful. And this is more of the traditional economic theory, right? So if you expect more uncertainty, more volatility ahead, you consume less, you save more. Let me also point out to an implication that I derive from what Geoff has shown in his research, which is, where do these higher savings go? Well, certainly not to productive investments, but if I take him literally, when you have high geopolitical risk, households tend to perceive housing like a safe haven. And so there's also this negative component related to the destination of the saving rates that is not helpful. But let me stop here for the moment.
Thank you, Mario. Arne, Laurent, do you want to come in and tell us your view on what is driving savings rates and whether they will come down?
Yes, for sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me. I mean, I totally understand this idea of uncertainty and then cautionary savings, but you could probably frame it also a different way, because there's one thing that is clearly certain, and that is that we're heading into a demographic crisis. And I mean, if you ask, or if you look at all the studies about our pension system, there's one thing that is very crystal clear, that everybody says that we have a huge pension savings gap. That people even are saving not enough to prepare for retirement, to maintain their living standards in retirement. So you could also put it the other way around. I mean, we talked a lot already about framing and editorial and how these things might be distorted perceptions. So people save because they have to prepare for their old age, for their retirement, and this is a certain thing. This is not, has nothing to do with uncertainty, because they know it, and it will happen because we have all the data already available. So I think this is a tricky issue always to say is people save out of fear. Maybe there's also some rational motives behind that. But I very much like what Mario said about this, how the savings are used and how they are not invested. This is also the reason why we often talk not about savings, but more about money hoarding. And this is really what's going on. And I think this is something we have to talk even much more, not about savings rates, but how these savings are then used and not sit idle on bank accounts, but really go into productive investments. I mean, we talk a lot about here in Europe about this savings. I mean, still struggle. I mean, it was the Capital Market Union, now it's a different name, Savings and Investment Union, I think it's renamed. So to really have this kind of European capital market, and if we could use all these savings, not holding at bank accounts or even under the mattress, but to use it to build and create a very lively, vibrant ecosystem for startups, for example, and that would be wonderful. So then we would probably talk that these savings rates are still too low to address all the structural and all the challenges we have ahead of us. So that's my 2 cents on this. Thank you.
Thank you. I know, Laurent, that you are on the investment side and business, but are you triggered by saying something maybe on Capital Markets Union and getting out of the European blues with a Capital Markets Union?
Thank you, Birgit, for inviting. So your question is about whether we can draw something on saving for corporates. Of course, the Capital Market Union or Saving and Investment Union is at the juncture between the pooling of savings and the allocation to corporate investment. So I agree it's linked. But what I wanted to say to start my intervention is that, in fact, for both for corporate saving and for household saving, we need to dissociate what is short-term factors, so monetary policy rates, uncertainty, which is cyclical when it's not structural, and structural impediments or structural factors such as the demographic forces, the pension system, and uncertainty, which can get entrenched. And this is precisely the case that we may face now with the trade war and the trade tensions. So I think in general, it's good to dissociate these short-term factors, which vanish, which disappears over the business cycle, from the structural long-term factors, which tends to be country-specific or sector-specific in the case of corporates. And what I can tell you, if I focus on corporate investment, is that the cyclical factor. So if we use the survey, it's a bit lagging now because the survey was conducted last year. We have the corporate survey at the EIB, which is conducted over 12,000 firms. It's a bit lagging, but we were not even last year expecting a major rebound in corporate investment because of three main factors. The prevailing level of uncertainty, which was already high last year, the elevated level of energy cost, which is an impediment to manufacturing investment in the manufacturing sector, which is more energy intensive, and the lack of skilled labor for corporates who may have to change their labor force to face the challenges of the green and digital transformation. So already these three factors were weighing on corporate investment last year. And what we were seeing also on the positive side was the rebalancing of the loosening of monetary policy, which was supporting the access to external finance, and therefore rebalancing toward better access to external finance at the time when profits were normalizing. So less internal finance was partly accommodated by better and easier, less costly access to external finance through monetary policy loosening. So this was happening last year, and if anything, I would expect, so the monetary policy stuff is a conjunctural response, but the structural factors will most likely they will remain. And if anything, the level of uncertainty that we will face this year when we conduct the survey, we are starting now, will be even higher, given what we have seen in the international sphere and given the loss in stock market that we have seen. So I think this year I would really the problem may be to disentangle what in the high level of uncertainty will remain, given the possible fragmentation of the world economy, from what is cyclical just due to the bargaining process, the retaliation, the policy function of the trade negotiators to retaliate from the Trump administration. Okay, but already last year we were not expecting a major rebound in corporate investment. I think it's in line with the European Commission or ECB forecast projections. And if anything, now the latest news are not on the positive side.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see the whole discussion going very much into the direction that fundamentals hold back consumption, they hold back investment, and uncertainty is the major topic, which will, of course, now increase or is increasing tremendously. Mario, can I get you in on this question on do you see business investment as super low, and what are the prospects of getting it back to normal levels? Is there any chance in the current time of uncertainty, or is it something where we have no chance right now?
Right. So if we look at what's happening at this very moment across markets, one is tended to be well on the pessimistic side, right? So what we know for sure is that regardless of actual policy moves, the mere increase in uncertainty that we have been seeing over the last few months, this is per se a very negative factor for investment. This hinders investment. It's not only geopolitical uncertainty here. What we're talking about is also recession risks, stagflation risks, call them whatever. This is not, in other words, this is not an environment that is conducive to higher investment. Let me, however, try and find a silver lining into that, or try to see the glass half full. So it is clear that we are facing times of high uncertainty, but especially in Europe, we're also seeing a reaction at the policy level over the long term. What I'm hinting at are the policy actions of the incoming German government, all the discussions that are taking place at the European level, around ensuring strategic autonomy and so on. So what I'm trying to convey here is that these heightened uncertainty that we're seeing in the short term is triggering a policy reaction that should lead to more certainty in the future. So policy action taken today at the European level should be conducive to an environment where everything is a bit more predictable than it currently is. And these in turn should be quite favorable for investment. Just to give another example, there are a lot of discussion, there's a lot of discussion ongoing, at least since COVID, but even before that, around making supply chains more resilient. Now, if policymakers achieve in making supply chains more resilient over time, this is clearly a positive for investment in the long run. Mm-hmm. And there's also this element of fiscal policy, just to conclude, especially the plans announced in Germany. So there's one channel which is more standard, is the clouding of private investment. So private investment induced by public investment. But there's also the channel that goes through an increasing confidence in the private sector, as shown by the IFO colleague in the previous panel, that could play a relevant role here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mario. You were already going in the future and saying that if we say the problem or the core of the problem is uncertainty, we must have a specific policy reaction of targeting these sources of uncertainty. It was what Ernest was saying in the beginning. If we have a fundamental problem, we must have a different solution than we have an uncertainty problem. And yes, I mean, we have two big real-time experiments going on. The US president destroying the world trade system as we know it, and the German government suddenly being fiscally expensive, what we were waiting for more than a decade. So there are big changes. And now I really would like to come back to Arne and ask him whether this is a game changer in Germany, the fiscal bazooka, or whether now maybe we have a short uptick in, yes, political will can resolve things, fundamentals will come back into the horizon, because people see that, for instance, the absorption capacity is extremely low in Germany and growth effects will only come next year. And maybe also the government will not agree on the right investment projects, but will go more for consumption spending. What is your take, Arne, whether we will have, what is the role of sentiment, the role of fundamentals, and will it be a game changer?
It's a very good question, if I would know. No, as we speak now, the new parties that form the next government present their coalition treaty. This was just going over the ticker, so we will probably know more in an hour or so. Yes, there's still, I think, a fair chance that it will be a game changer, because this was this 180-degree turn of Mr. Merkel, the would-be chancellor, get rid of the debt brake, massive new debts to invest in infrastructure, in defense, and so on. I think this was, at least for the first time, that many, or put it the other way, up to now, politicians was always talking a lot about Zeitenwende, the turn of times, as we call it here in Germany, but was not acting accordingly. There was this kind of disconnect between how you intellectually cope with the situation and what is happening on the ground. Now, for the first time, you get the impression that they really get the message. And this was probably the last wake-up call, and they spurred into actions, and now they will change something. On the other hand, and this can have, as you say, but in my view, also a positive impact on sentiment and narratives, and have kind of a confidence multiplier, at least for a short term. I mean, and you said, well, we didn't see it and the mood has not changed in Germany. Well, we are very simple. I mean, we are corporate economists. We don't wait for the, sorry, Klaus, for the next IFO survey. We just look at the markets. And what you have seen immediately, a reaction on the markets when this was announced, this 500 billion investment fiscal stimulus, then rates came up, equity came up, and the euro was stronger. And it was a very positive constellation because it was clear that this was not seen as something irresponsible, this distrust moment, but quite the contrary. It was seen as something that could bring Europe, Germany in particular, but also Europe forward, especially in the strengthening of the euro. This is also something I think very interesting what we can now observe, that the euro is getting stronger. We have this financial crisis, or maybe talk about upcoming financial crisis, recession, everything. Normally, then you have the flight to safety. This would be the moment of the dollar, no longer. So I think here is something, as also echoing Mario, that there's a great chance and a great opportunity for Europe to go ahead and to change things. But yes, I believe that it's only up to a moment. It's good to have this sentiment change, and it could trigger that also now companies invest more and more consumption, that many of the positive effects will be brought forward, but in the end you have to deliver. And there will be the moment of truth. And if now the new government fails really to deliver also the promised reforms, the promised structural reforms, the promised deregulation drives efforts and everything, then there will be the fundamental snapback, and then sentiment will also turn sour again. So for a moment, I think there is a sweet spot, probably a short term, where sentiment and fundamentals can decouple for a moment, where sentiment goes ahead. But then these are two sides of the same coin. If then fundamentals do not improve, but stay the same, then also sentiment will go back. And then will be probably even the backlash will be even bigger, because there is then this kind of disappointment that will drive sentiment even lower. I think this is, but for now we are still, I haven't seen the coalition treaty right now, but still I would say kind of a honeymoon. But as usually, as in every relation, honeymoon is a very short period. So, and it's important to get this positive vibes of the honeymoon also then into the normal life, and that has to be seen. But this is at least a good opportunity here in Germany to change things.
Yeah, thank you very much. Please wait another 10 minutes until reading the coalition agreement, but we are really
Hopefully not.
Yeah, in super interesting times. Laurent, if I can come back to you. You being a specialist on corporate investment, if you have a wish where you can tackle either sentiment or you target fundamentals, what would bring back, and you were pointing out structural factors impeding investment, but where would you target and bring back more animal spirits in the corporate investment sphere?
Okay, so I think animal spirit links to innovation capacity. So this is one segment of corporate investment which has to be fostered. We know that there is a lack of innovation in Europe, or not really innovation, but to bring innovation to the market, because you don't have the size, the corporate doesn't have the size. So it's linked to the discussion on the capital market union or saving and investment union about the need to support company with scale-up finance. So you need to grow to enable startup to become a bigger company, to be able to market their innovation, to put their innovation on the market. So this is one side. But in general, I think that there is a need to simplify, and the Commission goes in this direction, simplify the administrative, the reporting burden in Europe, and above all, to further integrate the European Union. So we just released the EIB investment report, and in fact, we have a chart in it which shows that the pickup in investment, so besides the conjunctural dynamics, which is linked to monetary policy and the business cycle, there is a pickup in investment in Europe when you have business opportunities. And over recent history, business opportunities happen during the creation of the common market in the beginning of the 90s. They happen late 90s with the setup of the euro and the European enlargement towards Eastern corporates. And since then, there is a bit of RRF impact, Green Deal at the end of the sample, but it's not commensurate to the two ones before. And I think that there is a need to set up a broad policy agenda, a bit in line with the Letta and the Draghi report, by the way. So to foster confidence, to dampen uncertainty, to integrate further the common market, and therefore to support investment. So really, innovation, corporate innovation is very core, but it's a specific problem. simplification all over the place, and integration for overall investment and GDP growth in Europe. So better enforce internal market, reduce dependencies, and strengthen rules, common rules in the internal market. In our survey that I was mentioning before, we have a question which is about the way corporates perceive foreign market inside Europe. And in fact, you see that most of the corporates, they still continue to say that the integration is not there. So I think 60 or 65% of corporates, they report different regulation, different administrative burden when they move from Germany to Austria, or from Germany to Italy, or from France to Ireland. So it's not. So there is a lot of work to do to revamp the integration of the common market in Europe. It's a core asset of the European Union. When you go to trade bargaining, you have 450 million citizens, which are potential customers to bargain. So if this is further integrated, it's even a stronger asset.
Yeah. So yeah, you have a long list of good ideas how to improve fundamentals. Yeah, out of a European institution, there is really room for improvement. I would like to, and by the way, the other economists and the audience, please challenge us. We are very much going towards structural reforms, and which then should boost confidence. Yeah, maybe we are going in the wrong direction. If I've listened to Katharina, who says that it's all about perceptions. Yeah? But if there is no veto now, I will ask my question, my last round of questions to the three panelists. And Ernest, I don't see any questions in the chat. Yeah, so we will conclude with yeah. I mean, we have heard a lot about short-term versus long-term, structural features against cyclical factors, things which we cannot easily change. Demographics brought in by Arne. Yeah? This is something which we more or less have to accept as a given. Yeah? But a single market, I would say this is not a given that we cannot go deeper on the single market. I share the enthusiasm of Laurent. But maybe we can, to conclude this workshop on a positive note, really, and I don't care whether you now mention a fundamental thing or a sentiment thing, each speaker, one glimmer of hope which you believe in will boost European sentiment and stop the European blues of getting worse. Arne, I start with you. I challenged you already on Germany.
Yeah, one glimmer of hope. I think it's hard to find, but I think what is really important here and what is our hope that we can protect and maintain European unity. Because I think Europe is also, and then brings back to Katharina and all things, perception is stronger than we often think of ourselves, and we are strong if we act together and if we act as one Europe, and then we have a good chance to withstand this assault of Mr. Trump, and then we have also a brighter future ahead of us if we no longer neglect all the challenges and the changing world, but really act actively, proactively, and just because I strongly believe that's now Europe's moment. Where we see it already on the capital markets, where capital flows are changing. You can probably build the same story for talents. There's no longer also all going to the Silicon Valley, to California, but coming to the free and liberal and tolerant Europe. So this is, I think, in many aspects, on many levels, where we can take over this role that is abandoned by the SS, some kind of a standard bearer of free, liberal values for our society and also then for our economy. And this is something, but again, I mean, this is why I think sentiment, and so this message has to be conveyed and continuously. You have to repeat it. I mean, the only thing that you can really adore about Mr. Trump is that he has such a simple message and he hammers this all the time until the people believe it. Maybe you should also learn one or two things. How we should do our messaging and our things here in Europe. I mean, Katharina, I don't think that you probably totally agree, but from time to time, in these times, you should not be too shy to use also some questionable methods to bring across notable good message. Thank you.
Thank you. Learning from Mr. Trump, yeah. Mario, your glimmer of hope, fundamental sentiment.
Yes, no, I agree with Arne. I would say on both fronts, there are more than glimmers of hope. So what we've seen over the last few months is government policies that have both created uncertainty, and you can easily think of some examples here, but also other examples of government policies that have reduced uncertainty, right? So again, stressing here the German fiscal U-turn. This is to say that so the sentiment across Europe has turned more positive over the longer run. What we need again after the last few days is a bit more of a boost of domestic confidence again at the domestic level. But if anything, I would also say that if the external environment has become more uncertain, challenging, and so on, domestic political uncertainty has also subsided in reaction to that. And you can see this in the latest Eurobarometer survey, for example, that we haven't mentioned so far, but it's pretty important. So this is also a further glimmer of hope. So to conclude, I guess that the soundtrack for Europe is not going to be a blues anymore, but maybe something more cheerful.
Okay, no bad luck in love and life. Good. Laurent, your glimmer of hope, sentiment, fundamental.
So I think if you have to twist to foster confidence in the European project, there are several avenues which are on the table. One is a coordinated defense agenda. So it's good that Germany moves and invests in defense. It's also good if all the European partners they have a common and well-defined agenda surrounding the defense, with possible spillover to innovation and the corporate ecosystem in Europe, for possible consolidation of some part of the industrial ecosystem. Then so defense agenda, research agenda more widely, and this is linked to what I was saying before, which is the saving and investment union. So there, I think we also have high expectation. We know from Draghi and Letta what we have to do. We knew before, probably, but it strengthened the need to have a common supervision for security markets. Maybe the opening of the 28 regulatory regime is also an opportunity. But some things have to move on the three dimension. I think if you really want to have more, to revamp confidence in the European project, defense, innovation, and saving and investment. Otherwise, okay.
Thank you. Thank you to my panelists. Very rich and also different views. Ernest, back to you.
Thank you, Birgit. Now, this concludes our workshop on Europe's blues, an interdisciplinary approach to weak economic sentiment. I cannot resist but make a few takeaways for myself. I think it became clear from the workshop that weak economic sentiment in Europe is indeed partly due to a difficult economic situation, increased uncertainty and the legacy of past developments, including high consumer price inflation, high energy costs, and unfavorable business conditions in Europe. The recent escalation in the global trade conflict is yet to fully show in sentiment data. Also, structural long-term factors such as aging, uncertainty about public pensions, and ongoing and forthcoming structural change may play a role. But the workshop also made clear that in the end, psychology, perceptions, trust, and other soft factors are central. This applies not only to private households, but also to businesses. Researchers and policymakers must seek to understand and disentangle the different causes for the weak economic sentiment and tailor policy measures to the various causes. We should remember in Europe to unite forces within the EU to mobilize unused synergies and remember Europe's internal inherent strength. Now, thanks to all our speakers. I hope you also enjoyed and benefited from our exchange. I certainly did and learned a lot. Thanks to all of you for joining and for questions. Bye-bye and take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.